Good morning, everyone. Whoops, sorry. Wait, okay. 1 second. Okay. Technology. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Melarie. Please feel free to call me Mel. I'm a first year industrial hygiene student. And it's been quite a long time since I've been in school, so I'm very nervous. I might cry, to be honest. And I know we have tomatoes, so please no throwing. Okay. Let's get into it. So my article that I chose today for Journal Club is on the contamination of firefighter PPE and skin and the effectiveness of decontamination procedures. Okay. Oh, okay. So a little bit of background. In 2010, the International Agency for Research on Cancer grouped occupational exposure as a firefighter as possibly carcinogenic to humans via a group 2B classification. Since then, before then, and especially since then, there have been a number of epidemiological studies that have come out on the relationship between firefighting and cancers, specifically cancers such as mesothelioma, cancers of the esophagus, lungs, intestine, kidneys, or cavities and more. So many of the chemicals that firefighters are exposed to can happen through different routes of exposures, but a prominent one is definitely skin. And types of exposures through the skin can be caused by permeation of the chemicals on the firefighter PPE, as well as penetration of the chemicals through their PPEs. Cross transfers is another type of possible route of exposure to firefighters, and researchers have also noted that they speculate that firefighter gear is not cleaned as often as it should be cleaned routinely. So they also anticipate that accumulation of the contaminants on the PPE over successive fires can also build up and then latch onto the skin at other points of their day-to-day. Okay, which leads us to the purpose of this study. This study was very ambitious in what they set out to do, even though it looks so simple, but we'll get into it. So the first goal of this study was to characterize the contamination of firefighter PPE after a structural firefighter response. They also aim to investigate contamination levels by job assignments. So what their duty is within the response, whether they're outside, inside of the burning structure and so forth, as well as tactic of how they put out the fire, which we'll go into in a bit later. And lastly, the third goal was to investigate the contamination levels before and after decontamination of the PPE gear and a little bit of their skin. So they did this by quantifying contamination levels via wipe sampling, as well as the use of thermal desorption tubes, and I believe that's a lime soda sorbent tube that they also did. So we have bulk sampling and as well as active sampling. So to characterize every single compound that firefighters are exposed to is very impractical and impossible rather. So for the focus of this study, they used more common things that firefighters encounter. And the first kind of group that they researched on were volatile organic compounds, which we know as VOCs, specifically the BTEX VOCs, as well as hydrogen cyanide. And the second group that they focus on are polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which I will now refer to as PAHs because it's a bit of a mouthful. And if you are unfamiliar with PAHs, they're a class of organic compounds produced by incomplete combustion or high pressure processes. So you can see this is prime firefighter environment. So there are hundreds and thousands of PAHs that meet that classification. So for the sake of the study, they chose 15 of the top more common ones to be analyzed via NIOSH method 5506. Okay, to get into methods, this is kind of where we can get lost in the sauce a bit. So I'm gonna go over the methods by kind of saying what the experiment was in its entirety, i.e. the scenarios that they conducted, as well as the sampling itself that helped them yield the results. Okay. So this study had a total of 12 scenarios where a team of 12 firefighters worked in pairs to complete 6 different job assignments that would encompass a typical firefighter response of a furnished home, sorry. So this study took place at the University of Illinois Fire Service Institute, where an architectural company designed a home for this study, specifically with 8 rooms total and 4 bedrooms within that 8 rooms, consisting of drywall walls and ceilings. So there were 4 bedrooms and there were 2 sets of bedrooms located on opposite sides of the house so that there could be a wall erected in the middle of the house, and they would use one side for firefighting one day, then the successive day they'd use the other side as well. And it allowed them to have turnaround, cleaning and prepping for the next fire that would take place there. It's important to note that the houses were fully furnished, but also that the fires themselves took place within the bedrooms. Okay, at the beginning of the study, firefighters were given brand new PPE, such as jackets, trousers, hoods, and gloves at the time of the study. And they were required to wear their self-contained breathing apparatuses anytime they were within the burn structure. They were given the liberty to decide if SCBA usage was warranted outside of the burn structure, and then they asked them to use their typical departmental protocols to see and decide for themselves if that's something that they should be wearing outside. There were a total of 41 firefighters involved in this study, and majority of them did a max of 4 scenarios. And there were a handful as well that did either the first 2 or the last 2 scenarios, and notably, 1 withdrew from the study. Okay, so I did mention jobs, and for each scenario, again, there were 12 firefighters that were divided into pairs based off job assignment. And the jobs here are listed in table 1, as well as what they did, how long they stayed inside and outside of the house that was burning, and as well as the kind of vehicle they're in, which is important. So we had a pair that was outside command, as well as outside pump, a pair that was inside attack, and so they were responsible for suppressing the fire within the structure. There was an inside search team that focused on going into the burning structure and rescuing any victims that would be there. There were no victims in the study. They used mannequins, so that's important to note. There was a pair of people doing outside ventilation, so they were trying to open windows and create vertical, horizontal ventilations that would help suppress the fire. They also had an overhaul and backup team that would support the inside attack firefighters in putting out that fire, as well as lastly, a pair that focused on overhaul operations and rapid intervention teams after the fire had been suppressed. Okay, so I did mention taxes. Did everyone file their taxes already? Okay. Tactic. I'd like to think there are more different ways to how to put out a fire, but for this study, they did focus on 2 types of attack methods. And the first one that we have here is the traditional interior attack. And that is where the firefighters would come in through the front door and try and suppress the fire that way. The second tactic that they noted was a transitional fire attack, which is where the firefighters will typically, through a window or an outside opening, will try to suppress the fire from the outside and then go inside the house to finish up the response. So this is a brief summary, a bit of how the scenario would pan out for this quote unquote realistic firefighter response. At the beginning of the study, they did pre-fire sampling of PPE, necks, hands. We'll go into that in a bit. And then we also had the study essentially begin here, where the fires were ignited within the 2 bedrooms. They were allowed to grow. The fire was allowed to grow until the room splashed over and became ventilationally limited, sorry. Forget English sometimes. Which typically took 4 to 5 minutes. And then the firefighters were dispatched by the vehicle they were in 1-minute intervals. So if we go back here, we see that engine 1 was dispatched first. So these, in theory, were the first, these sets of jobs were the first to arrive on scene. And then 1 minute later, truck 1, inside stirred, outside vent, was deployed. And then engine 2, overhaul backup and overhaul rapid intervention team. They went in, they did their job, suppressed the fire and all that. I will acknowledge I'm not too familiar with the firefighting job, profession, task, etc. So I only know briefly what they did in this study. Then after their firefighting assignment, they did post-fire sampling and decontamination of the gear. So about 40 meters from the burn structure, there was a PPE bay where they would doff their gear, take it all off, and then go to an adjacent biological collection bay where they would do the wipe samplings for their skin. And yeah, so that's how it went. Okay, let's get into the skin sampling, which are wipe samples. Okay, so before each fire, firefighters were given 2 baby wipes, essentially, to clean their neck and their hands. And they used a generic brand of baby wipes to kind of represent something that fire departments can readily get at any store that they pretty much go to. And then also before the fire, 1 out of the 12 firefighters were randomly selected for a wipe sampling of their hands and the right side of their neck. It's important to note that for the wipe sampling of the skin, corn oil was used as a wetting agent before the wipes were used. Okay, so after the fire, all firefighters again put corn oil on their hands, neck, and they collected wipe samples from the hands and the right side of their neck. They kind of did a little bit extra here where they again gave them baby wipes to clean their necks, and then more wipe samples were collected from the left side of their neck. And that was about 3 to 4 of the 12 per scenario. And this was done to provide a comparison of exposures to PAHs before and after the use of baby wipes. That's kind of a smaller objective of theirs. Okay, to get into the PPE sampling itself, PPE sampling consisted of wipe sampling as well as off-gas testing. So the wipe sampling focused more on PAHs, and then the off-gas focused more on the VOCs and hydrogen cyanide. To kind of try and make things clear, I'm going to explain the fact that at the beginning, the gear, after the fire, I mean, after the response, the gear were divided into 2 sets of categories, where one set was intended to be decontaminated, which I've explained, and then another set was left non-decontaminated, so that one wasn't touched. They used thermal desorption tubes as well as soda lime sorbent tubes to sample for VOCs and hydrogen cyanide in an enclosure that they built for 15 minutes. So an important thing to know here is they hung the gear in an enclosure to kind of represent what the firefighters, the cabin in the firefighter truck that the firefighters would typically be in when they're driving back to the station after a fire. And they sampled for 15 minutes to kind of represent that driving time that they would typically have back to the station after the firefighting response. So the decontamination methods that they had involved 1, a dry brush, where they use an industrial scrub to scrape the debris and contaminants off of the gear. 2, an air-based method where they took a leaf blower, modified it, and shot it at the gear to try and get rid of particulates that way. And then lastly, a soap and water mixture consisting of Dawn and water, and you can kind of guess how that one went. just essentially scrubbing it down as well. Okay, lastly, the PPE samples from turnout jackets were collected before firefighting, after firefighting, and after the 3 types of field decon. The researchers decided to sample different areas of the sleeve during each of these different times because they assumed that the distribution of PAHs across the entire skin would be even. As well as they collected non-decontamination gear after 2 fires and after 4 fires, meaning within the decontamination with non-decontaminated gear, they waited 2 fires, did a wipe sample, waited another 4 fires to kind of see the accumulation across those fires. Okay, so getting into the results of the study, obviously there were increased levels of PAHs with successive fires, which was expected, right? Exposure, more risk, and all. So figure 1 displays the contamination levels for the gear that was not decontaminated in the first 2 fires. And figure 2 is the contamination levels for non-decontaminated jackets after 4 fires. So it's here important to note that for the first 2 fires, they had 1 job, and then the second graph at the fourth, after 4 fires, they had a different job. So they switched job assignments there. Generally, we see that higher contaminants are found when the last job assignment in figure 2 was inside attack or inside search. And here's kind of where we have all the information essentially for skin wipe sampling on the hands and the neck. A large percentage of the neck samples were found to be non-detect when compared with that of hand samples. So we know that the data is automatically going to tell us that there were more levels on the hands than the neck. The researchers think that this happened because the neck typically had a higher limit of detection because of the surface area compared to that of the hands, in that it was smaller, meaning the limit of detection was a little bit higher for the neck than the hands. Notably, within these results, we see that the inside attack and inside search had the highest levels of PAHs, which makes sense. You know, they were exposed more directly to the fire than the other types of jobs. And the inside search team had the highest exposure between inside attack and inside search. Now, researchers think that is the case, that inside search had higher levels because typically they would be in a crawling position throughout the fire, trying to search and look for things. So they think like the contact with the floor and the accumulation of the fire that had built kind of resulted in higher exposure levels for the inside search team. Okay. Here we have figure 4, which is the off-gassing of VOCs and hydrogen cyanide, HCN on decontaminated gear and non-decontaminated gear. They found that while effective at removing contamination, field decon apparently had no effect on VOC concentration. They think this is because they think that the chemicals on the non-decon gear kind of naturally evaporated in the time it took them to actually perform the decontamination on the other side of gear. Oh, okay, sorry. 1 second. The mouse on.
You have to whack that thing kind of hard.
Okay.
Nemesis.
Okay. Okay, next, when comparing the decontamination methods, they found that the wet soap method was the most effective with the reduction of PAHs about 85%. They think this is the case because most chemicals like soot, which wherever you're from, is most like PAHs in its chemistry makeup. So they feel like the substances like this, liquid soap is kind of designed to remove those contaminants a little bit more effectively. They think that air The air-based sampling here was not effective because they don't think the air velocity of the leaf blower was great enough to overcome the surface tension of the sticky nature of like the soot. We do see that they had a little bit of growth of PAHs on the air decontamination method. So they think that was like an artifact or something. They think something went wrong there. They don't really know what it is. Okay, so to test tactic, they took wipe samples of the hands and neck. They did not find a significant difference between the type of attack that the firefighters used when suppressing the fire. So other findings, they did find a 54% median reduction of pH levels on the skin after using cleansing wipes to clean their skin post-fire. So again, these are the baby wipes that they chose, very generic brands. That's something the firefighters can easily buy at the store. So they're very proud of this findings. So they hope that this specific result will prompt more departments to encourage the use of baby wipes to clean their skins after fires. Okay, the discussion. The strengths of the study I found, I think that they set out to do a lot and they tried their best. I appreciated how intentional they were with their methodology. For example, if you remember, the off-gassing testing was conducted in an enclosed chamber, which was representative of what the firefighters would typically experience, right? They're gonna suppress a fire in one location and then drive back to the fire station. So that approach was very intentional in trying to measure the true representation of what they would have. I think it's a good starting point. As I mentioned in the beginning, there's not much, while there is a lot of research on the health effects, specifically on cancers with firefighting, there isn't necessarily too much on the role that PPE and cross-contamination and all of that plays into that risk. And I think it's important work, the firefighters, they're great. They really come in and help us in our times of need. So I think it's great that they focused on themselves. Okay, so the limitation itself. This is the one where I tried to go to many CIHs because I was just totally confused at what was going on. The NIOSH method that they referenced was 5506. And if you notice the sampling media that they used, and I enlarged it here, the sampling media itself for the method recommends a filter and sorbent tube, which they did not do for PAHs. They used wipe samples. So it's not that this idea of using a different kind of sampling media has not been done before. It has, but definitely kind of gives you a little weariness going into reading the results and interpreting the results, because there are many different things that are introduced when you stray away from the method itself. I also believe it's common practice when you're using a modified method to discuss it and kind of explain why you did what you did. But if I didn't personally look up the method myself, I wouldn't have known that this is kind of the direction that they went into. More limitations. The collection efficiency of corn oil as a wetting agent was unknown. There are studies that speculate that corn oil as a wetting agent has about 75% of a recovery. But again, that's not something that they can quantify and use face to face here. The PPE wipes. So if you are familiar with these PPE wipes, the newest line of these wipes are non-alcoholic. But at the time of the study, they used this version of the PPE wipes that did contain isopropanol. They believe that isopropanol can help in the recovery of the contaminants, but it's important to know that the isopropanol only consisted of less than half of the substance of the wipe. So again, not something they were able to quantify in any way. They had a small sample size, and we all know that raising that could help with strengthening the results. I thought it was very confusing to read itself. I thought it was kind of all over the place. I had to read a couple of times to kind of understand the sequencing of everything and all of that. And then the last thing are the assumptions that they made. I feel like they are very weak in that, and that contributed to their methodology, you know. They made assumptions that contamination levels were uniform across the sleeves and as well as the neck. And that's kind of why they did different regions of sampling. And I feel like if that wasn't the case and it wasn't uniformly spread across, then that could overestimate or underestimate the results. And then let me see if there's anything else. Nope, not yet. They also excluded non-detect samples. And they only focused on things that picked up values, and I feel like that could definitely introduce some biases into the results. Okay. No, one more time. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening. Yeah, any questions? Please, no questions. Okay, next, Bubba.
Sure, we got, no, we got 3 minutes. Those are pretty quick. But we've got to have some questions. We've got to have some discussion. What did some of you guys think about the article strengths, weaknesses, all that stuff?
Somebody in this room knows things about firefighting. How do the decontamination procedures they used in this paper compare to actual practice?
Yeah, so
That's before.
yeah, probably someone who has more ties to firefighting departments could probably answer this better, but they don't think the gear is cleaned as routinely as they could be. And they definitely acknowledge that the decon levels that they did in this experiment, air, dry brush, and soap and water, is probably not as effective as possibly sending the gear out to like a third party that's probably going to use different chemicals to clean. So they feel that decontamination itself, if it's not something that they're doing on a big scale, maybe they can do it on a smaller scale with these more tangible methods more frequently.
We've got Micah online,
Okay.
who can offer some insight into that.
Okay. What do you say?
Can you hear me?
Yep, we got you.
Great. Yeah, I think one of the difficult things about the issue is that there is a really heavy burden of resources on cleaning PPE. And if you're a small department of 2 or 3 stations, you often it's a lot harder to have replacement PPE. So essentially, the issue is the ability to clean it is related to how much money you have for additional turnouts, jackets and pants. It's a really specialized and time consuming cleaning process. So it's an issue that people are looking to, hey, how can we mitigate that if we can't get things to be cleaned right away? So um, knowing that wet soap methods might, even in a small population with data collection, might be effective, or baby wipes, stuff like that's super helpful. But even from a very large department with 20 or 30 stations, all the way down to departments with 2 or 3 stations, the culture is pushing really hard to look at, hey, how is it possible for us to make sure that we're getting our turnouts cleaned quickly, for these health reasons.
Yeah, the last thing government workers want is for you to tell them to do more. So I totally agree with those sentiments. And I think another goal of this study, hope of this study was that they can see that industrial cleaning is not necessarily practical. So they encourage that these smaller scale methods might be more easy to do, as well as like the baby wipes after there. You do see a reduction there. So they're hoping that these little practices can help firefighter safety.
Do you think this is helpful at all for understanding the carcinogenicity that's been associated with firefighting? Patient, as the article kind of started out as a recently identified as a higher level.
Yeah, I think that wasn't the focus of this study. I do think there are many other studies that explore the relationship between firefighting and cancers themselves. And, there was even a relationship that that found a dose response relationship between fire hours and leukemia. So I think other studies have kind of had that at the forefront of their mind. But this study was kind of a little bit more novel in that they focused on the PPE specifically and the transfer of it to the skin as an exposure route. Yeah.
Cool. All right, we're at time, so I'm gonna, well, good job.
Please go eat food and make sure you sign the sign-in sheet for account of food and for count of being here too.
Easy.
That's how it went.
I don't want any more chips left. It's out there on the table.
Imagine that.
We made it like in audience. Put in on those that use decontamination of just like second around here. You're on a specific hazmat team. Yeah. To say like that. Just hazmat English.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But as far as your everyday turnout here, like, now you're like CBAs, yes.
I'm not familiar.
It's just.
Okay.
The self-contained breathing apparatus, the face mask, everything, those give. Reps. Yes.
Okay. So we're going to be talking about report on the mortality of lunatics, or fatality. 1841. So we're going to be going back to one of the classical works of epidemiology, when first statistics were starting to be used to reason about social issues of the time. And I chose this article because it's one of my interests is in just historical stuff in general, mostly mathematical. But I found this also to be of interest because of its originality in epidemiological stuff. And also the statistics is a little bit easier for me to understand. So the AI component is actually going to let AI drive a bit in this presentation. I did not read the article. I just asked ChatGPT a lot of questions about it. We're going to see what his responses are about it, and we're going to see, and then I did read the article, and we're going to see what those differences are. And as a disclaimer about that, I wasn't able to give the article to ChatGPT because it said it was too big. But I guess it has enough historical context and enough World Wide Web content that it could talk about it pretty nicely. So prompt, a very short 1-paragraph summary of this paper. And the answer it gave is talked about the death rate among lunatics in asylums compared to the general population. And factors that are related to that. It says the paper talked about things like overcrowding, sanitation, neglect, poor care, poor hygiene, poor nutrition, stuff like that. And the conclusion of the article was reforms in treatment and living conditions for the lunatic population. I next asked what the historical context and background of this article was. And it says that lunatics were institutionalized with little to no care, that they had a poor social standing. You can think of the classical works during the time like Jane Eyre, maybe The Gambler, maybe The Devil by Dostoevsky. Think of that context as how lunatics were typically associated with their social standing. There was an increase in general concern for public health in England during this time, and that general health was generally poor. And he says that statistics was gaining a foothold in science. So there's our historical context and background. Where did Farr get his information? public records, Farr was apparently a statistician for the General Register Office, which I'm not too sure what that means, but he had access to a lot of numbers and papers. I also got some information from asylums, workhouses, hospital records, as well as coroner and medical records. And a coroner, if you don't know, is someone who investigates an event. Like, for example, if there's maybe a murder or if there's maybe a starting of a plague, then the coroner is the one who goes and investigates stuff like that. What were the statistical findings? Well, we see that the lunatic mortality was 2 to 3 times greater than those outside the institution. And then we compare the general population mortality rate of 1 in 40 to the lunatic 1 in 20. And that those mortality rates were mostly contributed by poor conditions called the paupers, P-A-U-P-E-R, just those poor folk who are mostly government supported. And that older and male people had higher rates. Just overall, the numbers were bigger. What did Farr conclude? He concluded that the asylum conditions were detrimental to health. And then we asked, what was the impact of this article? And he says that it raised awareness of asylum conditions. It influenced the asylum reform. It advanced statistics. It helped in shifting mental health perspective, as well as the generation of mental health policy. And then I asked, what are the weaknesses of this article? ChatGPT says that there's a limited understanding of mental health. The term that we use for this is lunatic, meaning we're combining all mental health categories basically into one, actually 3. As you were being admitted into an asylum or an institution, you had 3 boxes you could check. There was lunatic, idiot, and this other one. We've obviously branched out. And we understand a lot more about that today. The focus was more on mortality instead of treatment. That we're only looking at the death rates, not really on any disease rates or any other things. The data could be potentially unreliable or inconsistent. If this is being reported by these institutions, they might be really busy, not get around to it. They might fudge some numbers. They might want to look good, etc. Says that he did not fully explore external conditions such as poverty. What's causing the lunatic population? The suggestions that he gave at the end of his article were non-specific. All the data is quantitative instead of qualitative, meaning he didn't actually go out and interview the lunatic population or these institutions. These are all basically from records. And the focus was too much on institutionalization, meaning too focused on the asylums and not looking at the homes. If you had someone who had a mental health problem and you were keeping them at home, how does that differ from those that were sent to an institution? Finally, I asked, if I was prime minister at the time, what would you recommend I do? And it says I need to implement immediate improvements to living conditions and care, create systems for data collection, legislative action, education awareness, explore alternatives, etc. At this point, I did read the article and compared what I found with what ChatGPT gave us. So we're going to be cycling back through all these slides again. Short 1-paragraph summary. It said that death rates were compared between the lunatics in the asylum and the general population, and that's not necessarily true. It was looked at more at licensed housing. You can think of licensed housing as maybe an apartment complex or in a building that has been set apart and designated for use of the housing of this lunatic population. And that's as opposed to the asylum or the hospital or institution side. So these licensed housings are going to be smaller, more spread out. The institutions are going to be more big buildings, lots of people. It says that he talked about factors like overcrowding, sanitation, neglect, poor care. Mostly just the overcrowding was talked about. Almost nothing else was talked about. Things like sanitation, neglect, and poor care, they were mentioned, but not really talked about. ChatGPT also says that he concluded that need to do a reform in treatment and living conditions, and that's not true. He basically only talked about reform and inspection. A little bit more historical context, this is given at the last several paragraphs of this paper, is that when you got admitted to an asylum or institution or one of these licensed housings, it was very easy to get admitted and very hard to get out. You basically only had to have like a jury member or a judge member say, he seems like he belongs in this institution, so you were sent to the institution. So what Farr recommended is a reform in this inspection process where on entry and every quarter, and when you're released, you should have a professional, someone that's familiar with this population, do an inspection, see what the living conditions are, and try and just gain information in general about the population and the living conditions. And he says that from that, we can gain greater understanding and make better reform policies. The historical context and background, I agreed with the whole way. Previous to this paper, this is something I had to look up and dig a little bit into. And he does mention it in the first couple of paragraphs, is that the general care for the lunatic population was things like cells and a lot of constraints, a lot of coercion techniques, like straitjackets, ropes and things to care for these people. That has been improved a lot in the time of this paper. In fact, that's what caused this paper to be written, is that some number of years before, the government had noticed that this population is being treated very poorly. Things like jail cells and ropes and straitjackets and poor conditions, poor hygiene, etc. And so they told all these places, shape up. And then some number of years later, they were getting reports that they weren't shaping up like they wanted. And so Farr started investigating this type of stuff. Stochastic reasoning, statistics being used in science. There's really only averages and percentages used in this paper, which was nice because I could understand that. We haven't even gotten into like variances yet, really. So it's kind of interesting from that perspective. There's even a couple paragraphs where Farr is justifying his use of statistics, even for small things like, what do we put in the denominator of our fraction? He's arguing about his use of that, which is something that we're not going to see today because that's our exercises today. I generally agree with where Farr got his information. For the most part, all his information came from a specific asylum, as well as some licensed housings. But information was generally pulled from all of the places that ChatGPT said it came from. Additionally, I added this tables submitted by Colonel Sykes on licensed houses. So I guess he was one of the guys that went around all of these little places and got information from them. Statistical findings. Again, the mortality for lunatics was 2 to 3 times greater in the asylum than the licensed housing, and not necessarily outside the institution. So we're not getting information on the homes. We're not getting information about non-lunatics. I disagree with the general population mortality rate that it reports. I think these numbers are mostly made up because it says that the general population mortality was 1 in 40, but there wasn't any context for that. So I'm pretty sure that real number is 100%. And then it says the lunatic one is 1 in 20, which is actually better than what Farr reports. Farr reported generally like, of those that were released from the institution, about 50% or so had died. To be released, you were either cured, dead, or moved to a different institution or released in some other way. So mostly people from these asylums were dying. Poor conditions. Farr did explore the pauper population, the poor government subsidized population, and found that that was one of the big contributors to this population, as well as to the those that were dying. And then older and male had higher rates. That was true. Although the woman stayed longer in the institutions than the men would.
So is that the older person?
The woman
Yes.
after the kids. I'm starting to feel that myself. What did Farr conclude? Asylum conditions were detrimental to health. That's overly simplistic. Really, he shared blame between the asylum and the lunacy. One of the questions he brought up is lunacy or mental health a mortal disease? And he didn't answer that question. He said, actually, I guess he kind of did. He proposed that about 7% of the deaths should be contributed to the lunacy, whereas the others could probably be contributed from things like poor health conditions or overcrowding, bad hygiene, bad nutrition, etc. General impact. I generally agreed with ChatGPT that these things were happening. Raised awareness, better health, mental health ideas, advancements of statistics, etc. Weaknesses. He says that a limited understanding of mental health was a weakness. Yeah, sure it was, but it's more of just a societal weakness. Like they didn't know any better during the time. There wasn't anything he could do better about it. This was the general idea of what mental health was, and it was all just lunacy. The focus was on mortality and not treatment. That is true. The only data he really presents is on mortality. The data could be potentially unreliable for the reasons given. Since he did not fully explore external conditions like poverty, poverty was like the only external condition that he looked at. So I disagreed with ChatGPT with that. Other external conditions he didn't look at. Non-specific reform suggestions. I think he was quite specific about what he wanted and what he suggested. That's the changing on how people were admitted, as well as the quarterly inspections, stuff like that. He's pretty specific on what that should look like. And then too focused on institutionalization. I don't think so, because this was the whole point of the paper and the whole point of his work, was that people were getting reports that the asylums and the big institutions were doing much poorer than the smaller institutions. And so that's what he was investigating. That's what he reported on. That's the whole point of the article. If I was prime minister, what would I do during this time? I generally agree that these are all good ideas. However, I feel like most of these ideas are rather modern and very well could be considered impractical or not really well thought of back then. So ChatGPT is coming from a more modern perspective, I felt like, which was interesting. We now come to the thoughts and feelings portion of this discussion. One question I had was, how do I interpret annual mortality percent? This is the statistics I couldn't understand. And the way that was calculated is you have a number of people that go into the institution. A number of them are released. Of those are released, how many of them die? That's the percentage. And you've also got this annual mortality percent, meaning people spend a different amount of time in the institution than others. So you add all of that together, and then you use the deaths over that to calculate this percentage. And I wasn't sure how to interpret that. To explain a little better, in this bottom table, the last two columns make sense to me. The mean terms of treatment in years, about how long do people stay in the institution. The second column, what percentage of those that are discharged died. I can understand that, 35% of the people died that were discharged. Annual mortality percent, I don't know how to interpret that, because looking at the deaths out of 100 cases discharged, paupers in licensed housings was at 35%, and in the licensed in the Hanwell, 36%. So that says that the Hanwell one is doing worse than licensed houses, but if I look at annual mortality, the numbers are flopped. So again, I don't know how to interpret that. What are your thoughts on the stats that were used for this paper? Are there any lessons we can apply today? Any others? So those are the discussion items that I propose.
So in this paper, when they say deaths and like discharge, are they referring to deaths inside the asylums and institutions or outside?
Conditional.
It seemed like they separate them and then sometimes they don't separate them?
All the deaths are in regard to those that are released. So all the probabilities, all of the percentages, those are all deaths over discharged.
So not necessarily them dying in the institution.
If they died in the institution for any reason,
That's discharge.
that's a discharge.
I thought it was really interesting how it's clear that they're struggling with the same sort of statistical problems we struggle with today, like selection bias and things like that. Like the talking about the specific policies of one of the institutions where they discharged kind of the more problematic cases or people who were sick. And so because of that, their, mortality rates look better. But they just don't have the technical tools yet to deal with those in the data. So it's just kind of approached in this loose, almost literary way rather than in a technical sense, and I enjoyed reading that. Just kind of how empirics have changed.
I also thought it was interesting how nice the article was. Like they were like, oh, it's like poor conditions and not like, because knowing what we know now, there was a lot of like abuse happening towards people that were lunatics and like mental health in general, but in this article, they were more like, oh, there's like overcrowding and maybe some poor treatment. It's like, well, in like 100 years, we're gonna start cutting people's brains out. So like, we know that there's like this stuff going on in here. So I just kind of found that interesting. Kind of like nicer. It's to kind of the grind that's going on in there. Like I just thought it was interesting that they weren't like institutional issues, rather more like population issues.
Yeah. And I suspect that Farr is talking to an audience that has this general picture in mind. Like a number of years ago, they were put in jail cells, lots of straitjackets, bindings, coercion stuff. Now it's better. Today, it's quite a bit better, but still a lot to work on. I think the audience knew about that and the things that were going on.
So I guess my question is, did he mention anything about the cause of death? I mean, like, because people don't typically die of lunacy. I mean, that's not was it because of the conditions, or was it suicide, or what? Or did they die of natural causes? I mean, that's what I understood. Did they mention anything about what the cause of it was?
Things were proposed. I think the purpose of this article was to investigate that specifically, like the quarterly inspections and stuff. That gives them information about what might cause the death. So I think the purpose of the paper was to point out that obviously the asylum's not doing good, and we need to figure out why.
Then just one other thought I had is, did it mention anything about the difference in like maybe the criteria, the diagnostic criteria of the people that lived in the asylums versus in the licensed housing? I mean, were they all the same criteria, or or maybe the asylum people, were they maybe a little worse off, or did it mention anything like that?
I can't recall anything about that. I would suspect that the independent population, those that had more money, would go more towards the licensed housings, and the paupers would more be drawn towards the asylums. You could probably see that in the article with the population percentages. He does have that, but we'd have to look at the paper to see that distribution.
Just to provide a little more context on the paupers issue, in British law at the time, that's a legal category, because we're under like Victorian poor laws was started in like the 1830s or something. And the basic idea there is if you don't have a job, you are kind of a ward of your local parish. And prior to the Victorian poor laws, they just kind of each parish did their own thing. But most of them criminalized vagrancy, which would make you a pauper if you basically didn't have a job, because they don't want people wandering from parish to parish looking for work and being wards of different parishes. Like, you're an outsider, we don't want to support you. And so the adaptation that came in the Victorian period were the workhouses. And they were intentionally created to be these miserable, abusive situations because it was meant to be insufferable. So people would either leave town or get a job. And that was how they dealt with the social problem of unemployment in the early 1800s. And so I think it's important to kind of see this whole system of asylums and the licensed houses as kissing cousins to that kind of poorhouse system at the time. And I think that might, people who probably were on that like poorhouse to licensed house pipeline probably didn't have great conditions before they were brought into this system. So it was a mess.
One of the things I talked about here, I thought was interesting was, how difficult it is to capture this data into these closed systems even, and I guess how it can apply to today is we still have a lot of occupational injuries and illnesses that we don't capture in any good fashion, at least in our country. I mean, maybe it's a little bit different in some of the other countries, Scandinavia, for instance, but I think we're still left with all these gaps in making assumptions, and as primitive as the statistics are in 1841, despite our more sophisticated analysis and obvious advantages of computers, still have a lot of computation that we have to resolve with unknown numerators and denominators. Again, describe what caused you to select this? Because it seems like it potentially was a seminal article at the time. Is that?
My current work, I'm not doing a whole lot of like the papers that I'm reading for my work are all like engineering, robotics, technical. Not very not as appreciated here, like as a discussion for discussion contributions. But I'm interested in historical mathematics, historical stuff in general. And so the question I asked was, what are the classical works of epidemiology? And that's one of the ones that came up.
I like in terms of like lessons that we can still apply today. I like, and I think there's the former journalist in me coming out, but I like the idea of studying a population of people who are at risk, who are I can't imagine there were a ton of people advocating for them at that point in history, and for a researcher to identify that as an important topic to bring some awareness about, I think is pretty cool and something that could be applicable today.
I kind of want to talk a little bit about how I really like this article because in my limited experience doing research, it really kind of like highlights a lot of different things for me about why we do things the way we do it now in terms of bias, in terms of research, in terms of finding context for the study itself. As I was looking through this, I was just thinking what the cultural or situational what was going on at the time that may have influenced these results. But like she was talking about a little bit ago, the Farr was like lauding, like telling us about how awesome these people were who worked there, and just everybody else was dangerous idiots, right? So it just, I wonder if maybe part of it was politically motivated to be worded or recorded in this way. No, because it was so long ago. And the statistical part of it I really like too, because all the major have happened since. I swear, I mean, everything that we're learning about statistics right now has happened since this happened. So they were just working with what they have, But I really liked it.
Anything else?
Just as a final note of appreciation, someone had to compute all of this by hand.
You don't just start running logits whenever you've got to like do all of that, do the linear algebra.
Awesome. Good job, Colin.